Hello and welcome to This Really Happened, a place where unbelievable, heart-touching true stories come to life. Sometimes surprising, sometimes bittersweet, always real. Grab a drink and settle in. We're about to begin. Sarah was born and grew up in the countryside. She was a late, long-awaited child in the family, and so her childhood passed in an atmosphere of boundless love and acceptance. Her parents surrounded her with care, gave her smiles and hugs. Almost all the neighbours treated the girl with warmth. That was just the way it was in their village. Only those who achieved prosperity left for the city. Sarah attended primary school in her native village. There were only 5 children in the class, including herself. Sarah knew that in city schools, classes were much larger, 30 or more students, but it was difficult for her to imagine such a crowd of people. Time passed, and Sarah grew up quickly. In her teens, she realized that she wanted something more than the familiar rural way of life. Her parents were decent and kind people, but they didn't have any particular ambitions. They were content with little, preferring peace and quiet. The main thing was to have enough for food and clothes, the rest didn't matter. One day, this unpretentiousness turned into a tragedy that changed Sarah forever. Her father became seriously ill. He was taken to the city for examination and admitted to the hospital. An expensive operation was required. The family didn't have that kind of money. Even selling their old house wouldn't have raised the necessary sum. Of course, her father was treated, but the free therapy didn't give a noticeable result. In the end, the illness proved stronger. Sarah and her mother were left alone. It was then that Sarah understood, no matter what, she needed to become, at the very least, a very well-off person. Money wasn't just banknotes, it was freedom, protection, the ability to solve problems on which life depended. The first step towards her new goal was education. Before, she had thought of enrolling in a technical college in the nearest district centre. Now, her gaze was fixed on the capital. It seemed incredibly distant, difficult, and frightening. But it was there, she knew, that the best opportunities for a start were concentrated. Her mother worried about her daughter, but fully supported her aspiration. Despite their meagre means, she even hired tutors for Sarah. Sarah studied with incredible diligence, gnawing at the granite of science, forgetting about friends, entertainment, and even rest. She understood that she needed to fill many gaps in her knowledge. The girl studied on her own and with teachers. These efforts bore fruit. Sarah was admitted to one of the capital's universities, to the Faculty of Economics, and on a state-funded place. Seeing her surname on the list of admitted students, she couldn't suppress a joyful cry, and even jumped up and down. It hadn't been in vain. She had done it. The chosen university wasn't the most prestigious, but it had an important advantage. Non-resident students were easily provided with dormitory accommodation. For Sarah, this was critically important. She simply couldn't afford to rent accommodation in Moscow. The dormitory became a real salvation. So Sarah left her native Alexandrovka. She promised her mother that she would definitely finish university, find a decent job in Moscow, and then bring her to live with her. "The medicine is better there. Life is more interesting," she convinced the elderly woman. "You'll see, it will be good there." Her mother smiled and nodded, but anxiety flickered in her eyes. She was afraid to let such a young girl go alone to a huge metropolis, full, as she imagined, of dangers for an inexperienced provincial girl. However, her mother's fears proved unfounded. Sarah had a clear goal, and she confidently pursued it. Student parties, clubs, bar gatherings, all of this passed her by. Sometimes Sarah would, of course, go out with classmates to unwind, but very rarely. Her attention was completely focused on her studies. She saw how easy it was to be kicked out of university if you relaxed just a little and failed a session. Sarah couldn't allow herself that. She hadn't worked so hard to get in for that. Children of wealthy parents could, of course, afford some carelessness. Their knowledge, in essence, was paid for by their parents' money. Sarah had to rely only on herself. Besides, she was genuinely interested in learning. She felt herself becoming smarter, more confident in her abilities. Prospects were opening up before her. But soon another misfortune came. Her mother died. The elderly woman had been ill for a long time, but tried not to worry her daughter, understanding how difficult things were for her in the city. Sarah couldn't believe for a long time that she was completely alone in the world. Apart from her parents, she had no close relatives. The girl grieved heavily over the loss, cried, and reevaluated her life. She didn't fail her session. By that time, Sarah was already in good standing with the dean's office, and they met her halfway, giving her a second chance. Gradually, Sarah recovered from her grief and continued her path towards her goal, financial independence. Now that she was alone, this became the most important thing for her. She wanted to feel free and protected. Her classmates also dreamed of opportunities, but they came from well-off families, even if not super rich. Their lives included beautiful clothes, fashionable gadgets, entertainment, and travel. For Sarah, money symbolized strength and security. She understood that she had no one to rely on but herself, and nothing could knock her off that path. But there's another way to live beautifully. Chloe, a classmate Sarah was supposedly friends with, tried to convince Sarah. Chloe constantly urged Sarah to go to a club or bar, giving what she thought were strong arguments. You don't have to be a bluestocking and break your teeth on the granite of science. You're beautiful and young. There are plenty of rich guys around. Let's go, meet someone. You'll see, it's much more fun than sitting over textbooks. Sarah just shook her head. That option didn't suit her. Dependence on someone, that wasn't what she dreamed of. Dependence. Sarah sighed. She always felt a little uneasy when she remembered her former self, young, full of ambitious plans and hopes. Now the woman herself didn't understand how she had ended up in her current situation. After all, her attitude was right. She went straight for her goal, didn't get distracted, and everything was working out perfectly. How did it happen that in the end she found herself in such a vulnerable position? Sarah shook her head, put away the album with photos from her student years. Looking at her former self, she sank into memories. And sometimes she fantasized about how her life might have turned out if not for that chance meeting with David, which turned everything upside down. By that time, Sarah had already graduated from university. Immediately after graduation, she was invited to work for a large oil company. She had been one of the best students, and it was she who was recommended to the employer. She had to learn everything anew, master a lot in practice, because what was in the textbooks didn't always correspond to reality. Sarah stayed late at the office, digging in, learning from older colleagues. It was hard, but the salary and prospects were encouraging. The management rewarded her with bonuses, and she constantly moved up the career ladder. Soon, Sarah was able to save up for her own home. She became the owner of a one-room apartment, albeit small, in a not-so-prestigious area. But it was her personal living space, earned by her own labour. True, she had to sell the village house for this. In general, everything was going according to Sarah's plan. A good job, her own apartment. Yes, she had to work hard for it. but there was no other way. Wealth doesn't fall from the sky. You have to achieve it through hard work. The girl had learned this truth perfectly. It was difficult. Sometimes Sarah wanted to live like her peers, go out, travel, meet guys, have fun with friends, but her life was different. Work, household chores. She had to rely only on herself, do everything herself. And so one day, Sarah decided to finally go on vacation. She was given 2 weeks off work. She had money for a holiday. Everyone around her was constantly going somewhere. Why shouldn't she go too? Sarah chose a resort on the advice of a colleague, bought bright summer clothes, packed her suitcase, and flew from the cold early spring of Moscow to a hot tropical summer. Alone. None of her friends could go with her. Sarah saw the sea for the first time. It was wonderful, lying on the sand, exposing her body to the gentle sun, listening to the sound of the surf. Finally, she was able to truly relax and rest. The change of scenery worked wonders. Sarah didn't even go on excursions. She just rested on the shore next to the powerful, mesmerizing sea, feeling happy and peaceful. The resort was mainly populated by older people, couples, singles, with grandchildren. Sarah was quite happy with that crowd. She wasn't looking for adventure, she just wanted to relax. But one day, as she was about to leave the beach for dinner, he approached her. David. A young man in shorts and a tight white t-shirt that accentuated his toned, tanned torso. He had laughing eyes the colour of the sea wave, a charming white-toothed smile, and slightly dishevelled, sun-bleached hair the colour of ripe wheat. "Hi," he greeted Sarah as if they had known each other for 100 years. "I've been watching you for a long time. You're so beautiful and always alone." "Hi," Sarah smiled. She couldn't tear her eyes away from his captivating eyes. The guy was a real handsome man. They started talking, got to know each other. David said that he was on vacation here with his family. They had rented a bungalow near the hotel, and that he had been admiring her from afar every evening because he liked her very much. "You're incredibly beautiful," David said, looking Sarah directly in the eyes. "People must tell you that often?" The girl shook her head. She had almost no experience with men. There was always not enough time, studying, working, no time for dates. So now, David's compliments made her head spin. Of course, men had tried to approach her before, but Sarah... She was as if wearing armour. In the city, she remembered her goal and knew she couldn't be distracted. But here, by the sea, she suddenly really wanted to be close to David. He was so handsome, gallant, and pleasant to talk to. Perhaps it was because Sarah was at a resort for the first time, and alone at that. Her mood and perception of the world at that moment were completely different. In short, a romance began between the young people, bright, beautiful, passionate. Sarah finally allowed herself to relax. David showed her other places at the resort, away from the tourist trails. They watched the sunset in the mountains, kissed in blooming groves Sarah hadn't even known existed, went scuba diving near deserted beaches, something Sarah thought she would never dare to do. But David persuaded her, and she agreed, which she never regretted. She had never seen such beauty before, the coral reef and marine life in their natural habitat. It was a completely different world. There were also clubs, discos, and delicious, quickly intoxicating cocktails. David seemed genuinely in love with Sarah. He hugged her tenderly, looked at her with admiration, showered her with compliments, and gave her gifts. Sarah understood that most likely this was a holiday romance, and such relationships rarely continued. But she tried not to think about it and just enjoy the moment, have fun without unnecessary reflection, for the first time in her life. But unexpectedly, The holiday romance continued. Sarah flew back to Moscow earlier. Her vacation was coming to an end. She had to return to work, to her usual life. The day before, David held her in his arms for a long time, confessing his love. "I don't want to let you go. I'd spend my whole life with you here, in this paradise." Sarah just smiled sadly. She also felt sorry that this fairy tale was ending, but she was used to thinking soberly and understood. David would most likely quickly forget her, find another girl before the end of his vacation, and say the same passionate words to her. At the same time, perhaps he wasn't being insincere now, he really felt that way. But this was a typical holiday romance. There was nothing to count on. Although, of course, she also didn't want to part with David. Witty, kind, generous. It was so nice to feel again that someone cared about you, that you weren't alone. Sarah didn't expect it, but David continued to communicate. He called, sent photos from the sea, wrote long messages. The holiday romance didn't stay at the resort. And then David returned home. He also lived in Moscow, and he invited Sarah on a date. The girl's heart pounded wildly that evening. Was this really true? David hadn't forgotten her and wanted to continue? How would their relationship develop here, in the big city, not on the seaside? What if David was disappointed in her? Sarah worried in vain. As soon as David saw her, he rushed towards her, hugged her, pressed her to him, and all doubts vanished. "Can you imagine how much I missed you? You were in my dreams." A chance meeting at the resort grew into something more. The young people became very close. Sarah knew that David was still living with his parents. He had graduated from the Faculty of Economics, worked at his uncle's firm, but dreamed of his own business. He already had a plan, he just lacked the initial capital. David was actively working on this, saving up, investing, trying to start his own business. They talked a lot about this future business. Sarah found the idea promising. She had enough knowledge and experience to discuss it with David. The man impressed her with his intelligence and creativity. "I'm not afraid of anything at all," David would sometimes say. "Together we'll move mountains, build a whole empire, become rich and independent. And we'll be able to travel peacefully without thinking about anything. Just relax. Employees will do everything for us," Sarah immediately picked up. "True, we won't achieve this quickly. It's okay, we'll handle everything, overcome everything." Soon, David and Sarah started living together. They decided to settle in Sarah's apartment. David had his own living space. His parents had bought him an apartment in a prestigious area, but they set a condition. He would only move there after getting married. It was a family nest, not a bachelor pad. Slowly, the young people began to build their own business. Everything was going slowly. Sarah and David continued to work at their jobs, but every free penny was invested in the business. They had to save a lot, cut back. But both understood what they were doing it for. Soon it became clear that significant investments were needed for further growth. "Where can we get the money?" David asked one day. "What if you sell your apartment, this one-room flat? We won't live here anyway, we need something bigger, more decent, and the money will be just enough to promote our company." Sarah shook her head. How could she sell her one-room flat? Yes, the apartment was small, but it was her own home, earned through hard work. Especially since their business was still on shaky ground, it was unknown if anything serious would come of it. "Where will we live?" Sarah asked, not knowing what to say to her beloved. "I've thought of everything. We'll get married. I've wanted to propose to you for a long time. We'll register our marriage and move into my apartment. You know my parents' condition. Only move into the new apartment with a wife. The apartment is large, beautiful, the area is good. We'll be better off there. and we'll sell your one-room flat and put the money into circulation. We'll succeed, you'll see. We'll become rich, just as we dreamed, and achieve everything ourselves. Understand?" Sarah's eyes darkened. So much at once, the proposal to sell the apartment, talk of marriage. She needed to think, but David was so convincing and enthusiastic. Indeed, why doubt? He had proven the sincerity of his feelings. They were together. They had no one closer than each other. A happy family life and a shared business lay ahead. David was reliable. He loved her. It was visible in his gaze. What was there to think about? David and Sarah registered their marriage a month later. They didn't have a lavish wedding, although the groom's parents insisted. Of course, their only son was getting married. But Sarah, who could she invite? She had no relatives and few friends. And the money, it was better to save it for the business. Both were burning with this idea. The business was their common brainchild and dream. So, after registering at the registry office, they just sat with David's parents in a restaurant, celebrated the event, talked, and got to know each other. David's father left quickly. He was a busy man, constantly on calls, dealing with work issues. But David's mother, Eleanor, was retired. She had once worked with her husband, but had now stepped away from affairs. She was in no hurry. Sarah never understood whether Eleanor liked her or not. She behaved like a snow queen, unemotional, a little prim, impeccably polite. It was impossible to guess what she was feeling from her face. Sarah immediately understood. Their relationship wouldn't become close. That was just the kind of person she was, and it was a pity. She had so wanted to feel warmth and acceptance. "Mom is just like that," David explained later. "But she's good, really. Don't worry, she won't interfere." "I thought she wanted a different wife for you, from a wealthier family." "No," David smiled. "You don't know her. She doesn't judge people by their wealth. What matters to her is the person themselves. And you're wonderful, and Mom definitely understood that. She's good at reading people." They saw each other sometimes at family holidays or just for lunch together. Eleanor didn't seek closeness, but she didn't show aversion either, never tried to hurt or insult the lowborn. Sarah sold her apartment, the money was invested in the business, and it began to grow. Sales increased. New clients appeared. The small company turned into a noticeable player in the market. The business required a lot of time and effort, so first Sarah quit her job, and then David left his uncle's firm. The couple fully focused on their own business. Both worked tirelessly, standing shoulder to shoulder like two warriors. They weren't afraid of difficulties, and this brought results. There was almost no time for rest. Sarah spent days at the office. David travelled around the country looking for clients and suppliers. Each had their role, and each understood. Only together were they strong. The couple had many plans and ideas for developing the business. The shared work brought them closer, made them one. Sarah admired her husband's work ethic and enthusiasm, and he never tired of praising her. Sarah was excellent with financial reports and planning, and it was most often she who came up with successful ideas. The couple felt they were close to their dream. Soon, the business would be able to work almost independently, and they would gain freedom, money, the opportunity to travel and relax. They even enjoyed working, achieving success, winning, overcoming difficulties. But they still wanted a more flexible schedule. Both felt it was possible, they just needed to work a little more. And then, unexpected pregnancy, like a bolt from the blue. The couple hadn't thought about children yet. It wasn't the time. What kind of child could there be with such a workload? Heirs were, of course, planned, but in the distant future, when the company could work without their constant control. Sarah initially decided that the dizziness, nausea, and abdominal pain were from overwork. Or her stomach was acting up. She and her husband often ate on the go, forgot to eat. But the unpleasant condition didn't pass. Sarah had to see a doctor. At the hospital, she was shocked by the news of her pregnancy, advised to register, and prescribed vitamins. Sarah returned home in tears. David was working from home on his laptop that day. Seeing his upset wife, he turned pale. He thought she had serious health problems. "I'm expecting a baby," Sarah whispered. "How could this happen? We were taking precautions." "A baby!" David's face lit up. Sarah saw that her husband wasn't in doubt, but simply genuinely happy. "Really? That's wonderful! Wonderful!" "Wonderful?" Sarah was surprised. She had expected a different reaction, thought he would be flustered, angry, but this sincere joy, David's beaming smile, greatly influenced her feelings. The woman suddenly felt joy too. She had a child under her heart, their baby. It was a miracle, and no circumstances could overshadow this joy. The couple hugged and immediately began making plans for the future. That's how business-minded and practical they were. "It's okay. Our business is already at a level where I can handle it alone." David stroked Sarah's hair. "The main thing is, we'll have a baby. I've dreamed of this for a long time. I just didn't tell you. I saw you weren't ready yet." "Pregnancy isn't an illness," Sarah replied. "I can work while pregnant, and later, when the baby is born. Not like now, of course, but still." "We'll handle everything, don't even worry," David assured her. "We're together after all." But Sarah was mistaken. The pregnancy turned out to be difficult. The future mother felt unwell, often had to stay in the hospital for preservation. David said that her main job now was to take care of the baby, but Sarah felt inadequate because she couldn't work, couldn't be involved in the family business, and her husband had to spend all his time at the office alone. Now he was alone with all the problems. This upset Sarah. The woman hoped that things would get easier after the child was born. Not immediately, of course, but children grow up so quickly. Lily was born significantly prematurely. Due to prematurity, the baby had health problems. Sarah completely devoted herself to treatment and withdrew from affairs. Although, no, not completely. David still needed help with reports, and Sarah, after a difficult day with her daughter, would sit down at the kitchen table at night, delve into the financial figures, summarize, and draw conclusions. David trusted her with this, and Sarah valued that trust. Although it was hard, her eyes were heavy, her head was buzzing, Sarah didn't complain. She even liked the feeling that, while on maternity leave, she hadn't lost her touch, she was still good at her job. Lily gradually grew stronger. The diagnoses the doctors had warned them about were receding. But the girl was still capricious and sickly, requiring a lot of attention. Sarah was very tired. It was good that Eleanor took on some of the care. The mother-in-law simply adored her granddaughter, smiled at her, spoke gentle words, and Sarah, and even David, were surprised by this. "Mum just transforms when she's with Lily," the young father shook his head. "I've never seen her like this, not even when I was little." Lily performed a miracle. She melted the Snow Queen's heart. However, this had little effect on the relationship between Eleanor and Sarah. The mother-in-law still kept her distance, but they saw each other more often. Eleanor often came to take her granddaughter for a walk. For the young mother, this was a time of rest and peace, as necessary as air. 5 years passed. Sarah still couldn't return to work. She had to take care of Lily. The girl still needed rehabilitation and constant therapy. She often caught colds. The prematurity had taken its toll. Lily couldn't go to kindergarten. Sarah still helped her husband with reports at night. It was a lot, but it wasn't full-time work. Before they were equals, now David carried the family business alone. Sarah only helped. There was no shortage of money. The business brought a stable income. But the dream, for the business to work independently, was still far off. David spent all his time at work, and Sarah stayed at home, took care of the child and the household. Mostly Lily. This was a separate victory for Sarah. Doctors had predicted serious disabilities for the girl, warning they might end up with a vegetable. But constant therapy and rehabilitation worked wonders. Lily was now not much different from her peers. Yes, she was thin, often sick, but otherwise a normal child. And only Sarah knew what effort this required. And she understood. There was still a lot of work ahead, but Lily's prospects were excellent, which meant she had to keep working. Sarah was used to that. The woman had absolutely no time for herself. The child, the reports, the household chores, everything drained her strength. Sarah hadn't liked looking at herself in the mirror lately. She had gained weight. Not exactly fat, but not the graceful gazelle she had been 5 years ago. Her skin was grey from lack of sleep. There were dark circles under her eyes. Her hair was always pulled back in a messy bun. Her clothing style had become sporty. Her former narrow skirts and blouses hung in the back of the closet, gathering dust alongside her high-heeled shoes. Jeans, loose t-shirts, trainers, that was her everyday wardrobe. Comfortable, and the extra pounds weren't as noticeable. And you couldn't run after a lively child on playgrounds in heels. Her friend Chloe from university would scold Sarah. "You give your whole self to your family. Do you think anyone appreciates it? Probably not. You can't do that. You need to think about yourself too." "Of course I need to," Sarah agreed. "But how? Who will take care of Lily, the house, the financial reports?" Sarah preferred to think of it as a temporary measure. When her daughter grew up, then she would take care of herself and return to work. She just needed to be patient. It was a phase. Only this phase never seemed to end. David had somehow become distant. Understandable, work, many worries, but still. He came back late, or even stayed overnight at the office. He listened with half an ear. Lily's affairs barely interested him, and yet it was he who had once persuaded Sarah to keep the child. The only thing that connected them was discussing the financial reports that Sarah checked. Colleagues, boss, subordinates, spouses. They no longer went out together, didn't go anywhere, not even to corporate events. David preferred to go alone. "There's no one to leave Lily with, and anyway, you wouldn't be interested there. The crowd has changed. I wouldn't go myself, but my position requires it." Sarah understood perfectly well why David avoided going out together. She wasn't stupid. Of course, her husband was ashamed of her, overweight, tired. He himself had been like that a few years ago, but their family life, the child's illness, had played their part. It was painful to realize this. But what could she do? Sarah blamed herself for not keeping up, for not organizing her time properly. David even started avoiding her touch. Sarah tried to hug him, lean against him. He pulled away. An invisible wall had grown between them. Sarah hoped to regain their former relationship. She read psychologists, searched for information. She started doing abdominal exercises at home. There was no time for the gym. She exercised with Lily in front of the TV. Both of them even started to enjoy it. Sarah understood the marriage was under threat, and as a woman, she had a responsibility. She was ready to fight for family happiness. At that time, she didn't yet understand that it wasn't about her at all. The epiphany came late in the evening. David, as usual, returned late. Lily was already asleep. Sarah was reading in bed. David looked glum, thoughtful. He went straight to the bathroom, leaving his phone, which he usually never let go of, on the bedside table. When he was in the shower, the phone vibrated. Sarah knew. Her husband could be called at any time for work. Partners lived in different time zones. Late calls were not uncommon. Sarah decided to answer, just in case it was urgent. "Hello, Mr. David," a polite male voice said on the phone. "This is the Wind Rose restaurant calling. Your beautiful companion left her handbag on the table. I assure you, it's perfectly safe. A courier can deliver it to any address. We take care of our regular customers." Sarah carefully hung up. Almost immediately, the phone vibrated again. The person from the restaurant probably wanted the address. Sarah ignored the call. She pulled the blanket up, curled into a ball, and thought. Water was running in the bathroom. Her husband, David, was in the shower. The man Sarah trusted implicitly, as it turned out, in vain. She had thought their difficulties were temporary, that everything would get better if only they made an effort. And now it turned out that her husband was a regular customer of one of the most expensive restaurants, and he went there with a beautiful companion. The most hurtful thing was that there could be no mistake. David had been addressed by his full name and patronymic, Mr. David and his beautiful companion. So, David had a mistress. Well, a wealthy man could afford that. So, work wasn't the reason for his absence. Frequent business trips, perhaps holidays with his mistress, and Sarah. She had even felt sorry for her husband, who, poor thing, worked so hard. So while she was struggling alone with Lily's problems, getting the child back on her feet, creating comfort, poring over reports at night, David was having fun. He had stopped paying attention to her and their daughter, and Sarah blamed herself. How foolish she had been. At that moment, David came out of the bathroom. Sarah looked at him with different eyes. She noticed how sporty and fit his body was. Of course, he had set up a mini-gym in the office. Tanned, handsome, self-confident, and wealthy too. Such a man was a magnet for women. Sarah suddenly felt sorry for herself. David had lived as he wanted all these years. He loved himself, put himself first. And Sarah. For her, the interests of the family were paramount, and this was the result. She didn't even recognize herself in the mirror. "Your beautiful companion forgot her bag," Sarah said in a matter-of-fact voice, sitting up in bed. "What?" David was taken aback. "Did you take my phone?" "I answered a call. I thought it was for work, but it was about something completely different. A beautiful companion." David quickly composed himself. He went to the wardrobe, took out his pajamas, and started changing, as if nothing had happened. Not a trace of guilt, not a hint of confusion. "So, you don't want to tell me anything?" Sarah felt herself boiling. Unlike her husband, it was difficult for her to remain calm. "Well, you seem to have found out everything yourself." David took a blanket and pillow from the bed. It was clear he was going to sleep in the living room, right after this. "Still—" "All right." David looked at his wife with a calm, confident gaze. This made her even angrier. "All right. Yes, I have another woman. Young, beautiful, interesting. I find her interesting and fun, you understand? I feel like I'm charged with energy by her, and she loves me." "But I love you too." The words slipped from Sarah's lips before she could think. She didn't want to confess her feelings to her cheating husband, but it was the truth. Sarah truly loved David. He was still the closest person to her. "You love me?" David scoffed. "It doesn't seem like it. All I hear from you is, 'Lily, Lily,' as if there are no other topics, And anyway, look at yourself, what you've become. I didn't understand at first what was wrong. My feelings were cooling. But you're not just standing still, you're degrading. Her husband's words hurt Sarah deeply. It was offensive and unfair. You were smart and beautiful once. I've already realized that I have to accept it. We've just grown up, everyday life, a child. Maybe strong feelings only happen in youth. And then I met her, Jessica. She was like a breath of life into me. Everything became bright. I was living, truly living. But at home, here, with you, sadness and hopelessness inevitably descend. Jessica, on the other hand, gives me strength, energy, inspires me. Jessica, Sarah repeated. So that was the beautiful companion's name. Probably a model. David would hardly pay attention to anyone else. We're both to blame, David said. A note appeared in his voice. Sarah couldn't tell if it was sincere or feigned. Since you know everything, it's time to talk about divorce. Jessica is tired of being a mistress, of hiding. I was thinking of telling you myself. It was hard to decide. And then this happened. It's even good that it turned out this way. Not now, Sarah shook her head. I need to think. Of course, David nodded and left the bedroom with the blanket and pillow. Of course, Sarah couldn't fall asleep. She cried, burying her face in the pillow. Tears brought temporary relief, then torment returned. She blamed herself, then David, then this Jessica. What kind of creature must she be to have an affair with a married man? And Sarah also thought about the future. How would they live separately? Dividing property was difficult. Lily. She wasn't very attached to her father, but she would ask questions. What could she tell a 5-year-old child? Towards morning, Sarah fell into a heavy sleep. Lily woke her up. David was already gone. He had left for work. Or maybe not for work, who knew? 3 days passed. David was living somewhere else, probably with his mistress. Perhaps he had rented or even bought her an apartment. Sarah was slowly getting used to the idea of divorce. It was hard, but things happened. She began planning her future without her husband. She wasn't too worried about the financial side. Sarah had been doing the reports for so many years. She knew the business had excellent income. They would get good money after selling it, enough for a comfortable life. Plus the jointly acquired property, the apartment, cars. They wouldn't starve. She might not even need to file for alimony. But then a surprise awaited Sarah. They met with David in a cafe to discuss the divorce. For some reason, Sarah dressed as if for a date. For the first time in a long time, she put on makeup and a dress. Sit down, David invited her to the table. You look good. Well done. He was probably trying to be polite. Betrayal. Yes, that's exactly what it was. They talked a little about Lily. Then David asked, Have you decided where you'll live? What? Sarah was taken aback. Are you planning to sell the apartment? I thought you'd leave it to us for now. It's not the time to sell. Lily has rehabilitation. Let's do it later. Sell it? No. Jessica and I are planning to live there. She likes the area, the apartment. She has a bunch of ideas about renovations, so... What if I don't agree? Sarah felt rage. David had changed so much. He was ready to kick out his daughter and ex-wife for the sake of a new woman. Outrageous. Sarah wouldn't let him carry out his plan purely on principle. And your consent isn't required, David said. How so? The apartment was bought during the marriage. It's jointly acquired property, which means... Everything is registered in my mother's name. The business, the apartment, the cars, even the bank account. I told you, you've become distracted. You don't pay attention. You only mentioned one car. Sarah shook her head bitterly. Yes, David had registered a new car in Eleanor's name, explaining it with tax benefits for pensioners. Apparently, for the same reason, he had re-registered the business. He hadn't even consulted her. "You did this behind my back. You're a monster." "Don't exaggerate," David calmly countered. "Behind whose back? I gave you documents to sign, brought them home. As always, you were only thinking about the child and wanted to sleep. I didn't hide anything. You just didn't pay attention." Sarah remembered that period. Lily's life and health hung by a thread. Doctors were giving frightening diagnoses. Treatment required complete involvement. She was burnt out. She had lost her grip. She had no strength left for anything but her daughter. Perhaps David had been busy with the re-registration then. "Everything is registered with Mother, so you and I have practically nothing to divide." "That's not fair. How can you do this to us? What about Lily?" "I'll pay alimony for Lily, a decent amount. It will be enough for rent, living expenses, and treatment." "But we created this company together from scratch. I sold my only home for our business, invested everything because I was sure we were together, we would support each other, and now you're doing this." "To be honest, I was mainly in charge of the company. You stayed at home, you weren't particularly interested in the business." "What about the reports? You dumped a huge amount of work on me. It was hard for me. I didn't sleep at night. I compiled reports, and in the morning I was with my daughter at hospitals. Can you imagine what that cost?" "Why are you acting like a child? That's trivial, not even worth mentioning. Thank you for your help. I won't leave you without means. I'll help." "Thank you very much," Sarah blurted out bitterly. "Mark my words, I won't give up what's mine easily. I'll fight. I'll hire lawyers." "That's your right, but you'll just waste time and money. The documents are clean. The business is with Mother, the apartment and cars too. Lawyers will tell you the same thing." He left. Sarah sat in the cafe for a long time, digesting the information. She had just recovered from the shock of David's betrayal, and now this. Sarah hired lawyers. The process dragged on. She had to be in court often. Eleanor took care of her daughter. Yes, the same mother-in-law in whose name everything was registered. Sarah simply had no one else to turn to. She understood that Eleanor would support her son, and they didn't have a warm relationship anyway. Her mother-in-law kept her distance. Lately, she had even stopped visiting her granddaughter. But when Sarah called and asked for help, she didn't refuse. Sarah didn't bring up the affairs with her mother-in-law. She understood that Eleanor would listen to her son in everything. But she was a great help with her granddaughter. Sarah couldn't even hire a nanny. She had nothing now. She was living not on the money from their shared business, but on handouts from her successful husband. It was humiliating and hurtful. Sarah now knew what Jessica looked like. She sometimes appeared in court with David, tall, tanned, slender, long-legged. Long dark brown hair flowed beautifully over her shoulders. David's hand was almost always on Jessica's waist, and she looked at him so devotedly that Sarah began to understand her husband. It must be hard to resist such a look. David. It turned out Sarah had never known him, or he had changed drastically. The connection between them was breaking slowly and painfully. This was also difficult. Sarah turned off the light and lay down in what was still her bedroom. Soon she and Lily would have to leave, although hope, however faint, still remained. Tomorrow was the decisive hearing. Sarah's lawyers couldn't do anything. At the final hearing, the judge delivered the verdict. The documents were correctly executed. There was no joint property. Lily was awarded alimony, a pittance, as David, of course, had declared a minimal official salary for himself. Sarah walked out of the courtroom on shaky legs. She was left with nothing. She saw David open the door of a new SUV for Jessica. She gracefully slid into the passenger seat, and they sped away. What was she to do? How could she raise Lily? She couldn't send her to kindergarten to go back to work. She was too weak. Sarah called a taxi. She needed to go to her mother-in-law's, but this woman... She was also part of David's scheme. His mother couldn't not have known about her son's intentions. With a heavy heart, Sarah rang her mother-in-law's doorbell. She lived in a new building in the city centre, in a luxurious 2-story apartment. Eleanor opened the door and smiled at Sarah. Yes, she smiled. It was unusual. She was holding Lily in her arms. Lily was also smiling broadly. "Mommy's here," the little girl rejoiced, reaching out her arms. "Come in, we'll have coffee and cake now. We need to talk." Everything was very strange. Sarah sat modestly on the edge of a chair. "With milk?" Eleanor asked in a matter-of-fact tone. Sarah nodded. "Well, don't worry." Eleanor sat opposite her. "I know what happened at the trial. David has already reported it. You're left with nothing." "Why did he do this to me?" Sarah stammered. She hadn't intended to talk about it, but she couldn't hold back, and her mother-in-law had started it herself. "Why did he do this to you? It's not about you." The elderly woman shook her head. "Don't even think you did something wrong. You tried very hard. It's in his nature, his genes. I don't know. Maybe I missed something in his upbringing too." Sarah stared at her mother-in-law with wide eyes. These weren't the words she had expected. Eleanor seemed to be on her side. "My current husband isn't David's father, not his biological one. His father Peter raised him, and his biological father ran away as soon as he found out about the pregnancy. A prettier, brighter, wealthier girl took him away. And I was left alone. Peter had loved me for a long time. He supported me, accepted my son as his own. Only David, it seems, took more from his biological father than I would have liked. He treated his wife almost the same way his parents did, even worse." "I didn't know." "Well, now you do. David is a manipulator. Do you know what he told me about you to get my approval, to have me on his side during the divorce? That you were promiscuous and the child wasn't his. Lily. He told me this recently when he was re-registering the property. He said if there was a divorce, he didn't want to give you anything because you came to everything ready-made." "Ready-made? We built this business together, and I wasn't promiscuous. Did he really say that?" "He did. And I believed it, you understand. I always dreamed of a daughter, but God didn't give Peter and me children. And then there was Lily, my granddaughter, a girl, a princess. I adored her. I don't think I've ever loved anyone so much. And then David said she wasn't my own, that you had been unfaithful. Oh, how angry I was at you. Maybe you noticed. I stopped coming. I missed Lily terribly. I thought if I saw her less often, I would forget. But it didn't work. My heart ached for the little one." Meanwhile, her son started the divorce. He was happy that everything was with his mother, that the unfaithful wife would get nothing. Eleanor thought it was fair. A cunning girl came from somewhere, pawned off someone else's child. However, she could still understand that. She had been in a similar situation herself. Peter had also taken her with a child, only she had been faithful and grateful. And this Sarah, she had been promiscuous, at least that's what David said. He had suffered, tormented himself, tried to reason with her, then met a new woman and decided he couldn't go on like this. He initiated the divorce, and his mother supported him. Who would enjoy watching their child suffer? Sarah hired lawyers. She didn't want to part with the property. One of them found out that Sarah had invested not only labour but also money in the business, and Eleanor began to doubt. The lawyer made her think she hired someone who found out everything. That's when it all became clear. Yes, Sarah had sold her apartment and they had started the business with that money. And Eleanor understood that David hadn't told the whole truth. Hope appeared. What if the words about the granddaughter were also a lie? Eleanor kept a small envelope with David's hair in her family album, the first lock that was cut. Purely intuitively, before the last hearing, she decided to do a DNA test. She had the material. The results came today. Lily is David's daughter and my granddaughter. There are no doubts. Forgive me for doubting you, but David can be very convincing. After the divorce, David flew off to the sea with Jessica, feeling triumphant. They celebrated lavishly, choosing a luxurious resort. David believed everything was his. Jessica was also sure. She loved the beautiful life, believed she deserved it. Not everyone is gifted with such looks. She treated beauty as capital. That's why David tried to win everything. To afford such a beauty, he needed money. Now he had it. He didn't doubt his mother. He had worked on her thoroughly. His mother thought Sarah was promiscuous and hated her for giving her a granddaughter who turned out not to be related by blood. She had already loved the girl with all her heart. Upon David's return, a surprise awaited him. His mother had sold everything, the business, the property, everything. She could do this without his knowledge, as everything was registered in her name. David couldn't have imagined his mother would do such a thing. He was 100% sure of her. Eleanor gave the money to her granddaughter and former daughter-in-law, all the money. Now Sarah was rich, and he had nothing. However, his former wife showed generosity. When David had somewhat recovered from the blow, Sarah transferred half of the funds to him. She didn't even call, she wrote a letter. "We built this business together. The company is our brainchild. You betrayed me, you acted terribly, but I am not like you. As it turned out, we are very different. It is fair to give you half, so I will act justly. Now nothing binds us." Starting from scratch turned out to be less profitable. Then Sarah was by his side. They created the company together, supported each other. And now, David was alone, and he didn't always manage. He lost most of the funds he had received after the divorce. He made unsuccessful investments, made mistakes. Jessica, of course, soon left him. She found someone richer, more successful. Sarah, she moved with her daughter to another city, decided to start over. She had money to live on. Sarah and Lily travelled a lot, explored the world. It was fascinating. Sarah didn't maintain contact with David, and he didn't seek communication either. Perhaps he was ashamed to look her in the eye. But Sarah became truly friends with Eleanor. They often travelled together, talked a lot, and Sarah felt happy. She knew a long, fulfilling life and many interesting encounters lay ahead.